white police officer in the killing of a black man. Then, the harrowing journey of the Rohingya. Violent persecution pushes hundreds of thousands of this Muslim minority out of Myanmar and into Bangladesh's muddy camps.
Every scrap of land is being used by the refugees to make shelter. Since many of the refugee camps are overcrowded and such a large influx of people are coming in such a short period of time, people are doing what they can to make space for a home.
And it's Politics Monday. We take a look at the GOP's high-stakes race for Alabama's Senate seat and Sean Spicer's controversial cameo at the Emmys. All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us.
The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, helping people build measurably better lives.
and with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
For President Trump today, it was the kickoff of his first United Nations General Assembly. As a candidate, he had roundly criticized the world body. Today, he spoke at a meeting on UN reform and said the U.S. will work with Secretary General Antonio Guterres to make changes.
The United Nations has not reached its full potential because of bureaucracy and mismanagement. While the United Nations on a regular budget has increased by 140%, and its staff has more than doubled since 2000, we are not seeing the results in line with this investment. But I know that under the Secretary General, that's changing, and it's changing fast.
The president also met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and talked again of trying for an Israeli-Palestinian peace deal. Mr. Trump addressed the full General Assembly tomorrow. The president also spoke with Chinese leader Xi Jinping by phone about enforcing new sanctions on North Korea. This came as the North warned that new pressure will only increase its drive to develop more nuclear weapons. Meanwhile, in live drills, the U.S. military sent a pair of B-1B bombers and F-35 stealth fighters over South Korea. It was the second such flight in recent weeks. Hurricane Maria has closed in on the eastern Caribbean tonight, threatening the very same islands racked by Hurricane Irma. By this evening, the storm was passing Martinique with winds of 130 miles an hour, making it a Category 4 storm and still growing. The Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico are in the projected path tomorrow and Wednesday. There are new signs of recovery today in Florida, a week after Hurricane Irma swept the state. Schools in Miami-Dade and Broward County reopened for more than 600,000 students. Other systems and some colleges remain closed. In the hard-hit Florida Keys, Governor Rick Scott and U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services Tom Price warned today of potential dangers to those returning.
There's mold challenges, there are the marine life and diseases that occur, and so they need to take precautions. Simple wearing of gloves, making certain that when they're moving debris that they're being cautious, and that they're not inhabiting a place that is not inhabitable.
Utility crews have restored power to the great majority of those who lost it during the storm, but nearly 800,000 people remain in the dark today. Interior Secretary Ryan Zinke is recommending that 4 large national monuments in the West be downsized. It's widely reported the sites are Bears Ears and Grand Staircase Escalante in Utah. They cover more than 3 million acres, as well as 2 others in Nevada and Oregon. Zinke also recommended lifting curbs on logging and mining at several other sites. Environmentalists have condemned the proposal. President Trump has said designating these monuments amounted to a federal land grab. On Wall Street today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average gained 63 points to close at 22,331. The Nasdaq rose 6 points, and the S&P 500 added 3. And some history was made at the 69th Annual Emmy Awards last night. The Handmaid's Tale, which was shown on Hulu, won the Best Drama Series. It's the first such award for a video streaming service. And Lena Waithe became the first African-American woman to win an Emmy for Best Comedy Writing for the show Master of None. HBO's political satire Veep won Best Comedy, and Saturday Night Live won 9 awards, the most of the evening. Still to come on the NewsHour, 4 straight days of protest in St. Louis. On the border of Myanmar and Bangladesh, hundreds of thousands fleeing their homes. A judge speaks out on the growing backlog of immigration court cases, and much more. Anger over police shootings and whether officers are being acquitted too easily in some cases is boiling once again. For a 4th straight day, there were protests in St. Louis over a judge's decision that was issued Friday. It's at least the 5th case around the country since May where an officer was not convicted or found guilty in a high-profile shooting. Protesters were out early this morning in downtown St. Louis. A racially mixed crowd marched quietly and carried signs denouncing Friday's acquittal of Jason Stockley, a white former St. Louis police officer. Stockley had been accused in the shooting death of Anthony Lamar Smith back in 2011. Stockley and his partner tried to arrest the 24-year-old after a suspected drug deal, an incident that was caught on surveillance and dashcam video. Smith took off in a silver sedan, and the high-speed car chase ended with his being shot 5 times at close range. The dashcam recorded Officer Stockley saying he would kill Smith, and prosecutors argued he planted the gun inside Smith's car after the shooting.
I did not murder Anthony Lamar Smith. I did not plant a gun.
In an interview Friday with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, Stockley insisted again that he acted in self-defense.
I can tell you with absolute certainty that there was no plan to murder Anthony Smith during a high-speed vehicle pursuit.
The not guilty verdict touched off a weekend of protests by thousands of people. Most were peaceful, but smaller groups have turned violent after nightfall.
A group of agitators stayed behind, apparently intent on breaking windows and destroying property. This is not acceptable. We have work to do here in the city. We need more and better opportunities for all of our citizens, but destruction cannot be tolerated.
More than 80 people were arrested in Sunday's trouble as police in riot gear confronted the crowd. Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence O'Toole is the city's acting police commissioner.
These criminals we've arrested should be held accountable and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. We're in control. This is our city, and we're going to protect it.
It's all reminiscent of another case in nearby Ferguson, Missouri, in 2014, where a black teenager, Michael Brown, was fatally shot by a white officer who was also not indicted. And it comes on the heels of several other cases nationwide where black men have been shot by white officers. Now, St. Louis faces a 4th night of tension, with protesters turning out again and police out in force. For the record, we invited a representative from the St. Louis Police Department on the program, but they didn't respond in time. For more about the situation in St. Louis and what's fueling the protests, I'm joined now by Tony Messenger. He's a columnist at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and has been following these events closely. Mr. Messenger, I wonder if you could just give me a sense. What is your sense of what is driving these protests? Is this particular case, or is it something broader?
It's the combination of the details in this case combined with ongoing concerns both locally and nationally about police brutality towards blacks. And specifically in St. Louis, there's been such a history of a disparity between black and white blacks living in poverty and feeling that they're just not getting a fair share, that feeling that the nation saw in the days after Ferguson has continued over the last 3 years and is manifesting itself on the streets one more time.
One of the facts of the case here was the allegation that the police officer planted the gun after the shooting. The judge looked at that evidence and said it didn't meet the standard of guilt. And I wonder what's been the reaction to that?
I think what happens in a case like this is those details, regardless of whether or not the judge determines that the prosecution met its burden, stick in the minds of black people who believe that they have been discriminated against by police, whether it's St. Louis police or other local police departments growing up. And so you have the detail of the police officer being caught on tape threatening to kill the person that he's chasing, as well as the allegation from the prosecutor that the gun was planted. Those things add up to some details that really matter to the folks who are protesting on the streets, regardless of the judge's determination of burden of proof.
These were, as we reported, largely peaceful protests. There were a few instances of people breaking off and causing some destruction. What is your sense of what's driving that particular slice of the protest?
I think there's a couple of things. First of all, there's always going to be agitators, people that are hanging on, that are looking to create trouble, that aren't necessarily connected to the protest. In each of the first 3 nights of protest, the organizers of the protest have said it's time to go home. One protest leader who's a state representative said, let's leave as a family. But obviously not everybody left. And one of the things that I'm hearing from people and seeing in social media and other things is that some of the violence is a reaction to the police militarizing. It's a reaction to an aggressive police stance with police officers in riot gear circling around and arresting anybody who gets in their way. And so some of the reaction that you're seeing is, at least according to some of the protesters and folks on the street, a reaction to how the police are treating them.
One of the pastors who was involved in organizing some of the more peaceful protests said that the goal of these protests were disruption, not destruction. Can you help us understand what that means?
Sure. Disruption to the economy. One of the chants the first night, Friday night, when I was out there in the Central West End, was talking about disrupting the economy, letting the city feel their pain in the pocketbook, so to speak. And so when they talk about disruption, they're talking about the idea of U2 and Ed Sheeran canceling their concerts, and the city reacting to that by losing money and saying, we can't lose money, so what are we going to do? Well, what the protesters hope they do is talk to them and meet to them and hear their grievances. That's where they're trying to hurt the city, is in an area that will get them to the negotiating table to talk about how are we going to fix generations of grievance from people of color who believe that they have been discriminated against in this city by police.
Is it your sense that those protests, the economic pressure on the city, will both continue, and will they work?
My sense is that it's going to continue. There were some high school walkouts today. There are other protests planned tonight. There has not been, to the best of my knowledge, any discussion between community leaders, activists, protest leaders, and elected officials. And my sense is, similar to Ferguson, until those discussions start to take place, that what we've been seeing on the streets over the last 2 or 3 nights is going to continue for a period of time.
I know you've been covering this and Ferguson and other types of protests for a long time. What is your sense about when does this cycle end? It seems like we've been having this argument that communities feel they're not trusted, they're treated poorly by the police. These horrible incidents occur, police don't seem to be held responsible, and the community erupts. How do we interrupt that cycle?
Well, if you listen to the protesters, one of the things that they frequently chant is no justice, no peace. And so what they say is, it'll end when there's justice. It will end when police stop killing young black men. That's what they're telling us. The sense that I get 3 years after Ferguson is that not a lot has changed in our community. There have been some efforts at reconciliation and education, but the poor black people that I talk to regularly, that I write about in my column on a variety of issues, don't believe that they are a part of this economy, don't believe that they are full members of the community in some regard. And until that happens, until there's more trust between white and black, between police and the communities of color that they serve, then this sort of cycle is going to continue.
As we mentioned, we asked to talk to someone in the police force and they didn't get back to us in time. What is your sense of how the police view all of this? This particular case, but also the protests that have followed?
There is a split within the police department as well, between black and white. There is a split between those quality police officers who believe in a higher level of training and some of those who give the police department in St. Louis or St. Louis County or the multiple municipalities that we have around here a bad name. So within the police department there is somewhat of a split, but there is very much a divide between police and protester here. Last night the interim police chief for St. Louis said that police owned the night. And last night, police were recorded on video chanting themselves, "Whose streets? Our streets," after they arrested some protesters, some reporters, some live streamers, and other people. So that divide between protester and police is very stark still.
Tony Messenger of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Turkey has been an important ally to the United States for years, but recently, different views on how to fight ISIS in Syria, on human rights, and on a number of other issues have driven a wedge into that relationship. Judy Woodruff is in New York, and late today she spoke with Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Judy?
William, yes, I'm in New York, and I just finished moments ago a lengthy interview with President Erdogan on a number of subjects. But what I think is maybe of greatest interest is when I asked him about the report today. Again, this is a moment of tension and a season of tension between the U.S. and Turkey. A report today that the Trump administration has decided it will not go forward with selling guns and other weapons to President Erdogan's presidential guards. In a surprising twist, President Erdogan said this didn't make sense because he claimed that the U.S. has been giving weapons to terrorists in Syria, and by that he was referring to the anti-ISIS, Kurdish anti-ISIS groups. Let's listen.
We need to fight these terrorists with the United States, and when we are not able to acquire those weapons from the United States, why are you giving those weapons to the terrorists is the question that we ask our friends in the United States. And when these questions are not answered, we're feeling sorry as the strategic partners to the U.S.
Those are some pretty tough words about U.S. foreign policy. I know there was also a recent announcement last week that the Turks had purchased surface-to-air missiles from the Russians, Turkey being a NATO member, Russia being a pretty strong enemy of NATO. Did you ask the president about that, and what did he say?
I did, William. This has raised the hackles, as you can imagine, of other NATO members in Europe and in the United States. Questions about where does Turkey's loyalty really lie if it's cutting this $2.5 billion deal to buy these surface-to-air missiles. President Erdogan's response is that it was a logical thing to do. He said over time we've been asking other NATO countries for weapons. They haven't been willing to sell them to us. He said the United States won't even sell us drones. He said we've had that request in for a number of years. So he said it was only natural that we would turn to the Russians. And I tried to pin him down, if you will, a little bit about where his loyalty really lies. Is it with NATO and the West, or is it with Russia? And his answer was essentially neither one, both and neither, that we have to do what's best for Turkey. As I said, we covered a lot in this interview, and we're going to be bringing our NewsHour viewers much more of it tomorrow night.
All right, Judy Woodruff from New York, thank you so much. In the past few weeks, the crackdown on Muslim Rohingyas in Myanmar has triggered a mass exodus. The United Nations estimates that 390,000 Rohingyas have fled to neighboring Bangladesh after suffering what they say are violent attacks by government troops and others. The fighting is driven in part by an ongoing years-long conflict between Rohingya militants and the government of Myanmar. NewsHour special correspondent Tanya Rashid has this report from along the Bangladesh-Myanmar border.
It's a mass exodus. with no end in sight. They can barely walk or speak, desperate and starving. Close to 500,000 Rohingya Muslims have fled to Bangladesh in the past 3 weeks, escaping violent attacks carried out by Myanmar troops and Buddhist vigilantes. Hundreds of people are making their way into Bangladesh right now, and it's through terrible conditions of mud and rain and immense flooding. It's very slippery, the mud. To walk through this, I feel like you can fall down at any moment.
I can't move. Take this.
Get on my shoulders.
Her leg is broken.
Get on my back.
Really? Won't it be too muddy and hard?
There is no other way. Get on my shoulders.
The military, the Myanmar military, one of the members broke her leg with a stick, and a relative is having to carry her through this muddied rice paddy field to the road.
Give me your other foot.
I'm going to fall. I don't have the energy.
Anuwara Khatun has been walking with her 2 children and husband for 8 days, with little food or water.
They took us out of our home and lined us up at a school and set our houses on fire. They tortured us. That's why we're here. They didn't care whether they were shooting cows or people. They just kept shooting. They slaughtered old people. They tortured us, and that's why we left. They stormed in and burned our homes. The military surrounded us and killed any young men they could find. They killed 4 to 5 people in front of me in Lambaguna.
So this is the border. This is where Bangladesh ends. And across the Naf River is where Myanmar begins. For the past hour, I've been seeing boat after boat filled with Rohingya refugees coming in. The conflict was triggered by the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army, known as ARSA, an insurgency group. Its fighters attacked dozens of police and army posts across Myanmar's Rakhine state on August 25th. Funded partially by private donors in Saudi Arabia, ARSA accuses the Myanmar military of acts of extreme violence against Rohingya Muslims. In response, the Myanmar military launched a major counterinsurgency campaign. The UN human rights chief has called it a textbook ethnic cleansing. The Rohingya are a stateless Muslim minority group who have faced persecution in Myanmar. They are denied citizenship and freedom of movement. For the past 3 weeks, Myanmar's de facto leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, has come under immense international criticism for remaining silent in the face of this violence. Last week, the Nobel laureate canceled her trip to the UN General Assembly in New York to deal with the Rohingya crisis. The Rohingyas arrive in Bangladesh, hungry and tired, and into utter chaos. Every scrap of land is being used by the refugees to make shelter. Since many of the refugee camps are overcrowded and such a large influx of people are coming in such a short period of time, people are doing what they can to make space for a home. Hasina Begum fled her home 5 days ago.
The Buddhists burnt my village to ash. They shot my father dead in front of me. I traveled here through the forest with my family.
She told me she was helped by 2 armed men from ARSA as she crossed the border.
The Buddhists were killing us one by one before the August 25th attacks. That's why ARSA launched their attacks, because they are killing us. We couldn't take it anymore. That's why we are fighting. ARSA is fighting for all the Rohingyas in Myanmar.
Bengali locals and religious charities have stepped up to provide aid, but distribution has been chaotic. Bangladesh's Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has asked the international community to put pressure on the Myanmar government to let the Rohingyas return. The immense scale of the crisis means that international aid agencies are the only ones equipped to respond. The World Food Program is giving each refugee a 55-pound sack of rice. That has to last them and their family at least 2 weeks.
There are so many households, so many people, they are not getting the rice because the support is not adequate for them. So more food, more wash facilities, more shelter they need.
I spoke to women queuing for rice who told me harrowing stories of violence.
I can't sleep at night. They take women like us to be raped. The military made a woman give birth in front of them without any help. While she was giving birth, they stomped on her belly. Nobody could help her. The military took a child from me and killed her in front of my eyes. I couldn't stop them. They beat me with a gun and still feel pain all over my body. They take women into the jungle to rape and murder them. I heard them screaming, which was horrible. They tie them into a chair, pour gasoline over their head, and burn them alive. The army calls the children over to give them biscuits. Then they kill them and dump their bodies in the jungle.
Bangladesh is one of the world's poorest and most densely populated countries. I met with Mohammed Ershadul Haq, the local council secretary for the area near one of the largest refugee camps. He expressed concern that many local Bengalis share about the sudden influx of the Rohingya. What has been the impact of the Rohingyas coming in?
The Rohingyas aren't developed. Their character is uncivilized. We are different from them. If they continue coming like this, it will lead to destruction.
Do you see this large influx of the Rohingyas coming in being a threat?
With this influx of Rohingyas, us Bengalis will become the minority. They will influence all the sectors of society. They might claim Bangladesh to be Rohingya territory. They built a makeshift camp on my land. They cut the trees from my garden to make their own homes. We aren't able to say anything right now. It could be that they will rule over us here.
Do you see the influx of Rohingyas coming in being a breeding ground for terrorism?
Attacks have already taken place in the official refugee camps. The Rohingyas attacked the local security forces.
Next to one of the largest camps, I met 2 Rohingya refugees who are members of the ARSA insurgency group and plan to go back to Myanmar to fight. They agreed to speak to us under the condition that we conceal their identities.
The other Rohingya people support the ARSA because they think that if ARSA extend to get back the right of Rohingya, and they will be able to move freely from town to town, from village to village.
But what do you think of the August 25th attacks? Hasn't that sparked all this violence that's happening right now and this mass displacement of the Rohingya people?
The other superpower countries and the whole world, they are still not responded with any kinds of responses. ARSA thought themselves that there is no one for us in the world to help. It's better for us to extend ourselves, to protect ourselves, to save our people from the inhuman persecutions of Myanmar government.
We love ARSA. We are willing to go to war for our rights. Rohingyas have rights. This is why we will fight with the Myanmar government till we get rights. We don't want to live without our citizenship, and us Rohingyas understand this. We are all united with ARSA. We will fight for our rights or we will die trying.
Are you willing to die?
Of course, I am willing to die. Of course. ARSA don't afraid of dying because the Rohingya people already have died.
As the violence continues in Myanmar, the future for the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh looks bleak. Stateless and displaced, the sense of desperation is increasing day by day, making the perfect conditions for insurgency groups like ARSA to grow. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Tanya Rashid in Teknaf, Bangladesh.
Stay with us. Coming up on the NewsHour, Hillary Clinton explains why she thinks she lost Wisconsin, and a grandma setting records in weightlifting. But first, an inside look at the country's overwhelmed immigration court system. Our John Yang is here, and he has that story.
William, you know, for all the headlines and all the debates about what to do about illegal immigration, much less attention is being paid to the nation's immigration court system. It's the first stop for most people charged with being in the country illegally. The current backlog is at a record high, more than 600,000 cases pending, with about 334 judges to hear them. The average wait time for a hearing is 672 days, nearly 2 years. Earlier, I talked with Judge Dana Lee Marks, who's been a judge in San Francisco for more than 3 decades. Immigration judges are generally prohibited from giving interviews, but Marks spoke with us in her role as president of the National Association of Immigration Judges. Judge Marks, thanks for joining us. Help us understand how immigration courts work. Who appears before you, and what is it you're trying to decide or determine?
Well, immigration is often compared to tax law in its complexity, but I'm fond of saying that immigration law is even more complicated than tax law because no one has developed a TurboTax for immigration law. Immigration courts are the trial-level courts that someone comes to if the Department of Homeland Security asserts that they are in the country without proper status or that they've somehow violated a legal status that they had, such as being a tourist who worked or a student who no longer went to school. We try to decide if they are in fact here in unlawful status at this point, and then decide if there are any benefits they're entitled to apply for under the very complicated Immigration and Nationality Act.
And we've heard about the backlog overall. How many cases are pending before you? And how long does it take to someone for one of these cases to get before you for a hearing?
I have over 3,000 pending cases in front of me personally, and it often takes as long as 4 to 5 years to finally hear a case and make a decision on the merits.
So for those thousands of people, what's the real-world implications for those people to have that backlog and to take that long to get their case decided?
That's a great question. The backlog is extremely problematic for many people because evidence that they have becomes stale, they lose track of witnesses, sometimes they need to have a certain relative as a qualifying relative in order to obtain a benefit, and that relative can become ill and die, or the relative has to be underage, and just by the passage of time, that person becomes an adult. So there is frustration often from people whose cases are pending before the courts that it's problematic to them that their cases are pending so long. In essence, we're doing death penalty cases in a traffic court setting. We are already working at light speed, and yet the stakes for the people who are before the courts can be a risk to their very life, particularly if they are fearing persecution or other harm if forced to return to their home countries.
And do they have lawyers representing them?
Removal proceedings, deportation proceedings are civil. There is no right to an appointed counsel. So the only people who have lawyers are those who can afford to provide them or those who are lucky enough to find volunteers. Overall, approximately 60% of the people who appear before us are able to find lawyers. But if you look only at cases where people are detained, only 15% of those individuals are able to find representation.
And this backlog started actually in the previous administration, in the Obama administration. What has the increased enforcement or the stepped-up enforcement of the Trump administration done to the backlog? What effect has it had?
What's been difficult for us is that the backlog has been growing for over a decade. For various reasons, the immigration courts have not been a priority for budgeting, and the amount of money that has gone to immigration law enforcement has not included an equivalent amount of additional funding for the courts. So we have been struggling, and over the past few years, it's just become dire. The courts are basically on the verge of being completely overwhelmed and collapsing under the caseload.
Now, President Trump has rescinded DACA, the program. He said it'll sunset in 6 months. Congress may try to do something about it, but if that program were to go away in March 2018, what would that do to the backlog? What would that do to the immigration courts?
The estimate on how many people are here under the DACA program ranges from 700 to 800,000. We don't know how many of those individuals already had cases in immigration court, But if even 100,000 of them did, those cases could immediately be reopened. And you could imagine what such an action would do for the court dockets, that we would instantly be inundated with an additional tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of live pending cases to begin to put on our dockets again.
The Trump administration has moved some judges to the border states, or to the areas along the border, and also started to hire more judges. Has that helped at all?
Well, the moving of judges to the border so far has been problematic for the judges because we have been taken from our existing home courts and moved on a temporary assignment to address cases at the border. The hiring of new judges eventually will be extremely helpful, but it is not a rapid process. And we also have a veritable tsunami of immigration judge retirements on the horizon. Last June, it was estimated that 39% of the immigration judges on board were eligible to retire. So it's going to be quite a while before we have enough judges on board to handle the existing backlog of current cases.
Judge Dana Lee Marks, president of the National Association of Immigration Judges, thanks so much for taking the time to explain this system to us.
Thank you so much.
On Friday, Judy Woodruff sat down with Hillary Clinton, the former Secretary of State and Democratic presidential candidate, to discuss her new book titled What Happened. We return now to that interview when Judy asked about Clinton's campaign against Donald Trump and mistakes she might have made in certain key states.
Do you think your campaign was negligent, or whatever word you want to use, in not raising enough warning signs about the perils that could lie ahead in Wisconsin and Michigan? Those states, of course, turned out to be crucial to the outcome.
Well, when you're in a campaign, you look at the best information you have. And our best information from polling, from what's called data analytics, from people on the ground, did not indicate that we faced what eventually happened in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. We campaigned hard. We had more people on the ground working for my campaign than President Obama had had. We were in constant communication. What do you hear? What do you see? Wisconsin's a particularly interesting example because Russ Feingold, someone I served with, was running again for the Senate. His polling and the polling done by the Senate Democrats showed he was going to win. I ended up doing better than he did. There were all kinds of factors, and one of the biggest problems in Wisconsin has been the well-executed effort to suppress voters. African-American voters in Milwaukee, young voters, particularly in Madison and elsewhere. It proved to be very effective. And we campaigned hard in Pennsylvania. We campaigned hard in Michigan. I was there the day before the election. So I just don't believe that those were the determining factors about how many visits, how many people made. I just don't buy that.
Judy also asked Secretary Clinton about the criticism of her campaign from within her own party, specifically from former Vice President Joe Biden.
You also had some comments about former Vice President Joe Biden, and I want to ask you about that because he said after the election that he thought your campaign and Democrats in general didn't adequately communicate to Americans who were economically strapped what Democrats were prepared to do for them. Isn't that very similar, if not the same thing, your husband, President Clinton, was telling your campaign before the election?
No, and look, I'm a friend of and a big admirer of Joe Biden. He and I have worked together. We served together. And I point out in the book, you know, every day we were talking about jobs and the economy. Post-election analyses said I talked about jobs more than anything else and more than anybody else. We had really specific plans. I was talking about them endlessly, but they weren't covered. When you get 32 minutes in a whole year to cover every issue and 100 minutes on emails, I don't fault voters for not knowing what we were saying. Joe campaigned for me. He talked about jobs. Everybody else talked about jobs and what we were intending to do. But you know, it turned out not to be enough in that particular environment.
And finally, they turned to health care, which, if you remember, was one of the major sticking points during the Democratic primary contest. Judy asked Secretary Clinton about her former opponent, Senator Bernie Sanders, and his recent health care proposal.
In the campaign, you, on a number of occasions, argued with Bernie Sanders because he argued there should be more of a government-run health care system rather than expanding Obamacare. Now he has this new plan out to expand Medicare, cover more people in the direction of single payer, and dozens of Democrats are behind it. Are they making a mistake?
No, it's an aspirational goal. I believe in universal health care coverage that is affordable and high quality. There are a number of ways to get there. I think some are more likely than others. During the primary campaign, I did defend the Affordable Care Act because for the first time in our history, we had 90% of Americans covered. And as I said over and over again, it's a lot easier to get from 90 to 100% than ripping it up and starting all over again. But as someone who's worked on health care to try to get to universal coverage for 25 years, it matters how much it costs. It matters what people feel about giving up what they already have, and half of America gets health care from their employers. It matters what kind of standards are going to be expected and whatever benefits there are. You know, the devil is always in the details when it comes to universal health care coverage. So I think having a debate about the best way we get there and having people really lay their cards on the table so that it can be examined is important.
I ask because some Democrats are saying it is a mistake, that this takes the focus. It in essence seeds the fact that Obamacare hasn't worked and that there needs to be another way.
Well, that would be unfortunate, and that would only be true if Democrats in large numbers in the House and Senate stopped working to make sure the Affordable Care Act continues. I think there still is a lot of energy behind that because the likelihood of us getting to a single-payer system, starting from where we are, is quite difficult. So let's not throw the baby out with the bath. Let's stay focused on how we're going to deliver the highest quality, most affordable health care right now. And then you want to have a debate about something better and different, go ahead and have the debate.
You can watch the entire interview with Secretary Clinton online at pbs.org/newshour. And it's the beginning of the week, and so we are joined now by our regular Politics Monday duo, Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report and Tamara Keith of NPR. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Before we get to Alabama and policy and all that stuff, let's talk about Sean Spicer and his little cameo last night on the Emmys. For those people who didn't see it, he comes out and it seems like he's trying to poke fun at his first day on the job. President Trump's inauguration, he comes out and all evidence notwithstanding, he says that the president had the biggest audience ever in the entire history of the universe. And that was his declaration. And he pointed his finger at the journalist and told him, report this. Last night, during the Emmys, Stephen Colbert is wondering about the size of his audience, and out comes Sean Spicer. Let's take a look at that.
This will be the largest audience to witness an Emmys, period, both in person and around the world.
What do you make of that?
You know, this is life imitating art, imitating life, right? He was actually channeling Melissa McCarthy, who you see there, who was making fun of him in her Saturday Night Live skit. Look, this to me is a sign about where we are more broadly as a culture, which is there is no such thing as having bad publicity or notoriety. You can always cash in on it, and it's very short-lived. So the name Sean Spicer is one that most people know today. It's hard to know that it's going to be the same a year from now. So take it while you can get it. Take it to the bank. A lot of other Trump supporters, his former campaign manager, for example, got fired, then ended up as a CNN commentator, is a lobbyist now. So people trying to use their cachet while they can. very Washington.
Tim, what do you think about this? Is this us not being able to take a joke, or is this us, as many people have argued, that we're being encouraged to chuckle at the idea that it's just fine for the press secretary to lie to the American people?
Well, this is Sean Spicer's rehabilitation tour, his image rehabilitation tour. He also went on the Jimmy Kimmel show, and then today in an interview with the New York Times said that he regretted that press conference where he came out and told reporters, report the facts that were not the facts, they were alternate facts. And that was sort of the original sin of his entire time as press secretary. He came out and said something that was verifiably untrue, and it led to further questions about whether what he said was true, whether what was said from the podium in the White House press briefing room, which has typically had some connection to reality, whether that could be trusted from this administration.
Some connection to reality. I love that. Okay, let's talk about the runoff. Next Tuesday in Alabama, very big Senate runoff race.
Right.
Roy Moore and Luther Strange. What is at stake in that particular race?
Well, these are two Republicans that are challenging each other. And what's interesting here is it is the choice between which Alabamans are going to like more. Or their choice is between loving Trump more or whether they dislike Mitch McConnell more. That is what they get a choice between. Roy Moore is the outsider. He is a former state Supreme Court judge. He's been kicked off the bench twice now, but he's running as the anti-establishment, anti-Washington firebrand. Luther Strange is in a strange position, which is he's been endorsed both by Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is coming down on Saturday to campaign for him, but he also has the support of Mitch McConnell and the leadership. So really what we're looking for here is how strong is the Trump connection? Can support from Trump, the president coming down, giving outward, in this case, rally, outward support enough to overcome what voters' reticence, especially in a place like Alabama, for the establishment? Roy Moore, polling has shown him ahead, some by bigger margins, some by smaller. So Luther Strange, who is the incumbent right now, he was the interim here, replacing Jeff Sessions, starts off as the underdog. The real question for Republicans, what really is at stake, two things. One, if Roy Moore wins and comes to the United States Senate, the fear from Republican establishment, people like Mitch McConnell, is he's another rogue agent. They have very few votes that they can lose. They only have a 52-seat majority. They can't afford somebody else who goes off on his own tangent. And the second is it may encourage, if he succeeds, it may encourage other candidates to challenge sitting Republican incumbents. That's not something they want to deal with.
So, Tam, the president can read these polls. He must know, even if he prefers Strange, that he might be backing the guy who ends up losing. Like, why is he willing to risk capital on this?
I haven't quite figured that out, to be perfectly honest. It's a big question. And the other thing is, you know, President Trump is doing what Mitch McConnell wanted him to do, which is endorsing Strange and working for Strange. But the flame keepers of President Trump's, agenda, the Steve Bannons, the Sean Hannitys, they've all endorsed Moore, and so it's this really bizarre fight for, who is the true Trump candidate, the guy who Trump endorsed or the guy that all of Trump's allies endorsed. And I don't know how this is going to turn out and what it will mean for President Trump's political capital. I mean, the interesting thing is, in this case, he's for the incumbent, whereas in some other states, he's talking about wanting to primary the incumbent Republicans.
Right. Yeah. Right. Let's talk about health care quickly. The GOP, it seems like, are taking one last stab at putting the dagger in the Affordable Care Act with the Graham-Cassidy bill. Why are they pushing for this?
It's about a deadline. That's usually what gets people motivated in Washington, is they look and they see we only have a certain amount of time. In this case, September 30th is the last day that Republicans can pass a health care bill with just 50 votes under this reconciliation deal. After that, they've got to get 60 votes. So this is really the time to be able to do this. Talking to folks who cover this today, there's a great deal of skepticism that this is going to happen. It's pretty clear that the folks that held out on the first version, John McCain, Lisa Murkowski, Susan Collins, Rand Paul, are not committed to this. Rand Paul's already come out publicly and said he's not for it. So still I would not say it's impossible, but the odds are longer.
Last to you, Tim. On the Democratic side, you've seen Bernie Sanders has been pushing his Medicare for All plan. We just saw Hillary Clinton express some skepticism about that, sort of implying that it wasn't that realistic. But yet a lot of Democrats, including many who are thought of as 2020 contenders for the presidency, are signing on to this. So why are they risking capital on something that may never go anywhere?
Well, and Bernie Sanders says this bill is not going anywhere. They, I think, see this as a way to send a signal, to say that they care about health care. And they're not talking about what's practical and pragmatic. They aren't in that stage yet. It's, 2020 is a long way off.
Tamara Keith, Amy Walter, thank you both very much.
Welcome. You're welcome.
Finally, to our NewsHour shares, something that caught our eye that might be of interest to you as well. Staying in shape is difficult for many people, no matter their age. But one Virginia grandmother is raising the bar, literally. The NewsHour's Julia Griffin has this profile.
Commissioner of the Revenue's Office.
Between the phone calls and family photos, you'd be forgiven for thinking Linda Lightly is your average government employee easing toward retirement. But as her co-worker, Becky McNaughton at City Hall in Fairfax, Virginia knows, Lightly isn't the type to take anything easy.
The first or second day I worked here, Linda came into my office and she asked me to check out her butt because it was very, very solid. And that is how I learned that she was a power lifter.
At age 72, not only is Lightly a competitive power lifter, she's a record-setting one at that.
I have set several world records, which I'm really proud of.
Lightly competes in 100% Raw, a worldwide powerlifting organization that emphasizes clean, steroid-free competitions. Since 2014, she's garnered 12 world records in her age and weight categories. 132-pound Lightly can deadlift 273 pounds, but she wasn't always so in shape. In 2006, after years of shuttling 3 children and 6 grandchildren to their athletic activities, she finally got her own itch to work out.
I was 60 and I was very sluggish, and I said, I really need to do something for me.
Blaine Doolin is Lightly's personal trainer and coach.
She was a disaster when I got her. She, first time we exercised, she almost fell over doing a lunge.
But Lightly stuck with it, and within a year she lost 40 pounds and found a love for weightlifting along the way.
Every once in a while he'd say, well, do you want to stay here or do you want to lift higher? And I'd say, I want to lift higher. I mean, because it felt so good.
Soon her strength was getting noticed.
One day, I think she was picking up 220 pounds when she was 68. Somebody mentioned, does she compete or whatever, and I looked it up, and the world record was, I believe, 232. And I thought, well, why not? If you want to, why not give it a go?
Expectations and preconceptions were broken at that first competition.
There was another gal from the gym there, and she said, don't worry about it. Whatever you do, it's a success because you're here for the first time. Don't worry about it if you fail. And I looked at her and I said, I don't have any intention of failing.
She set a world record then and has set at least one every other meet since.
The key to Lightly's sustained success, Doolin says, is making sure each lift is done correctly and safely.
I hate to yell at somebody's grandmother, but if I yelled at somebody's grandmother for picking up weight improperly, because if she gets hurt, we're done for months, maybe indefinitely. So I go out of my way to try to make sure she does everything right.
At most events, Lightly is often the only person her age, or even close to it. That, says her daughters Colleen and Mary Beth, is what crowds find so inspiring.
To see how all these young 20, 30-something-year-olds were cheering for my mom, who's in her 70s, so it was really neat.
We always say she's the strongest woman that we know, and it's literally and figuratively.
For her part, Lightly is just glad to show that age is no restriction when it comes to physical fitness.
Some of the younger lifters, female lifters, come over and they say, you are a role model to us. This is the goal we'd like to have as we get a little bit older. It's really an amazing compliment.
A compliment that just might top her long list of accomplishments. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Julia Griffin in Fairfax, Virginia.
I love that her name is Lightly. What an amazing woman. On the NewsHour online right now, nominees for the National Book Awards were named late last week, and among them were authors who have written essays for the NewsHour. You can watch their takes on reading challenging fiction, choosing to live without fear, and reconciling with marriage after a parent's divorce. That's on our website, pbs.org/newshour. And that's the NewsHour for tonight. On Tuesday, we'll have Judy Woodruff's interview with Turkish President Erdogan and a look at President Trump's speech to the United Nations. I'm William Brangham. Join us all online and again here tomorrow evening. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you and see you soon.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by BNSF Railway
and by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, supporting science, technology, and improved economic performance and financial literacy in the 21st century.
Supported by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, committed to building a more just, verdant, and peaceful world. More information at macfound.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.